How much computer RPG feel do you want your virtual tabletop to give you? The answer is going to be different for just about everybody. Today we're going to talk about what that might mean for your player's experience and what it means for you as a game master as you decide what add-ons to use for your Foundry setup. Let's jump right in. If you're new here, I'm Josh, this is Copper Dragon Games, and on this channel we talk about Dungeons & Dragons, mostly virtual tabletop resources. Today we're going to talk about how some Foundry setups feel more or less like a computer role-playing game than others, what that means for you as a Dungeon Master, and also what it means for your players and their experience in your game. I've spent a lot of time on this channel sharing about different add-ons for Foundry Virtual Tabletop, the ones that I like the most, the ones that I think you'll get the most mileage out of. I've also watched plenty of my YouTube peers go on about their add-on setups and which ones they recommend. I've even joined some other people's games just to see what other DMs are doing with their own setups and how that feels from the player side. And here's what I've come to realize through all of that experience. Foundry is so customizable that it creates this interesting little metagame where dungeon masters or game masters, what have you, actually spend a lot of time trying to find the perfect setup for them and for their groups. And honestly, it's fun. We get to fiddle with all these different add-ons and the way it helps us present our fantasy worlds to our players and share information in different personalized ways. And here's something I really didn't take the time to consider when I started out, and I'm not sure how much other DMs are taking the time to consider it either. When we choose to run our games with a virtual tabletop like Foundry, we are by default making some decisions from the virtual tabletop that we choose as the one we want to use to run our games, all the way down to the way that we use the tools within that interface. We're choosing where we want to fall on the spectrum between that old school kitchen table RPG that most of us got started with, all the way up to a very video gamey, automated computer RPG where we just happen to be the narrators of the action. Now, let's be real. A virtual tabletop game is never going to be as personal as the type of games that you would run in your own home with your friends that live nearby. It's also never going to be as video gamey. Is that a word? I don't think it's a real word. I'm going to be using it for this video though. So video gamey. Yeah. It's never going to be as video gamey as playing a real computer RPG like Skyrim, for example. By using a virtual tabletop, we fall somewhere in the middle, but depending on how we set up that interface and how we set up our game and how we run our game, we may be leaning toward one side or the other. For example, those folks who are running their role-playing games through Zoom with just theater of the mind and some physical dice that everybody's rolling on their end of the video call, that's about as close to a traditional home game as you can get while still playing virtually. So they would fall over here somewhere. Using D&D Beyond for character sheets, that brings you a little farther over. Using Owlbear Rodeo or something similar for your maps, a little bit farther over still. Using a program like Fantasy Grounds to automate like almost all of combat, that's going to be way on the other end of the spectrum. The coolest thing about Foundry, in my opinion, is that depending on what add-ons you choose to add, you might find yourself anywhere on this spectrum. You can make out your Foundry game to be pretty much anything from it's just a fancy battle map all the way up to we don't really fiddle with combat mechanics anymore because it automates everything for us. But why am I bothering to make a video about this? Why does it matter to you and why does it matter to your players? The truth is there are pros and cons to all of these approaches. No matter where you end up on this spectrum, you're not doing it wrong as long as you and your players are having fun. But I do think it's important to consider what your preferences are and what your players' preferences are so that you don't end up in a campaign that is unintentionally not fun or unintentionally frustrating for you or some of your players just because of the way you set up the game in the first place. Every add-on that you incorporate in your game that changes an interaction from you and the player to Foundry and the player makes the game a little more video gamey. For example, An add-on like Tidy UI changes the interface of the game, but doesn't actually change the interactions between you and your players. On the other hand, an add-on like Loot Sheet is going to change the interaction that you have with the player. However, you normally would have tracked inventory and tracked looting after combat. It's going to be very different once you add in Loot Sheet, because it changes the way that works. Whereas in a kitchen table game, they might be saying, yeah, I'm going to take the longsword and the gold and the gems. With Loot Sheet, they don't have to say that at all. They just drag it into their inventory. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it is definitely different. And people have different preferences. So when you're recruiting for a game, say you're setting up a game online, you're looking for players, whatever, I think it's a good idea to let your players have an idea of where you fall on that spectrum, especially when you're using Foundry, because there's such variation between how different DMs set up their Foundry servers. When you sign up for a game and you know the DM is going to be using Owlbear Rodeo, you know that the setup and the map is going to be pretty simplistic. It might look really cool, but it's not going to automate a lot. You're going to have to track your own character sheet through something else, whether it's on paper, or maybe D&D Beyond, or a Word document or something. I don't know, whatever you choose to use. That virtual tabletop's not going to handle it for you. When you sign up for a Fantasy Grounds game, you know that you're going to be tracking almost everything within the game. You're not necessarily going to be rolling a die, telling your DM what you rolled, and then letting the DM tell you the result. You're going to be dragging the attack up to the monster you want to attack, and then letting the program tell you whether you hit or not, how much damage you did, and so on and so forth. My point is that as cool as it is that Foundry users get to choose where they want to fall in between those two extremes, it's important to let your players know ahead of time where you fall between those extremes when you're setting up your game. So that's my advice to you as a DM. If you're using Foundry, there is so much customization. Make sure you let your players have a general idea, roughly where you stand, as far as how much automation you're going to include, which add-ons you plan to use that really influence how the players interact with the virtual tabletop, and therefore how they interact with you as the DM as well. So that's it for now. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time when I'll be back with more tips and tricks to make your Dungeons & Dragons games, or whatever role-playing games you happen to be running, more amazing than they've been previously. See you then.